There are two Linux phones that are starting to be sold in late 2019. These are the Librem 5 from Purism and the Pinephone from Pine64. Let's talk about the differences between these phones and which one you should buy if you're interested in Linux phones. Up next. If Linux phones are a new concept to you, then let me introduce you to a new word related to these devices. It's called convergence. And this specifically refers to the convergence of mobile and desktop. At the moment, only a Linux phone operates the same way in desktop as in mobile. The commands are the same, installation of the software is the same, capabilities are the same. The differences are in the form factor. The mobile phone has a smaller screen and it is touch-based. A desktop has a larger real estate on the screen and uses a mouse or touchpad. This is completely different than, say, iOS versus Mac OS, or the old Windows Phone versus an actual Windows desktop. And you will find this limitation in a big way when it comes to moving files around. An iOS or Android phone really has no file system, so you cannot move a file around from app to app. And it is difficult to move documents around that don't fit into a specific app framework. And then there are the limitations set up by Apple and Google. I'll give you a real example. I use this scanning program on my phone to scan documents, but the only way I can send a document to my Windows computer is via email or some cloud option like Dropbox. Since the documents I scanned are secure documents, I'm so limited by this. I can't just go to a browser and upload a document made by another app. In addition to limitations such as not having a file system, apps on iOS and Android are heavily curated and must follow certain programming structures as well as behavior to be allowed on those platforms. A Linux phone is just a desktop computer. Thus, there really are no limitations. There's a standard file system and the behavior is consistent enough that most people who use Linux already know what to do with the OS and the device. And in fact, if you know how to use Windows or even a Mac, it would be pretty much the same. For example, both Linux phones have an SD card slot, so I can easily store files and retrieve them from the SD card. I can even transfer the SD card to a Linux desktop computer. I can copy photos and files without effort, or move the MP3 files around for my music. There are other specific privacy benefits to Linux which I can only get by moving away from the yoke of servitude to both Apple and Google and their spy devices. Now, Linux phones have been tried before, and to be honest, they failed. The time wasn't right, and there were big deficiencies in what they could do. What's different today is that the initial offerings came from Purism in the form of the Librem 5, which just started shipping. This phone is not just a Linux phone, but it addressed the main concern of privacy. It is the only phone where the issue of privacy was well thought out and advanced as a goal. After that came the Pinephone from Pine64. This phone has some privacy features, though not as extensive as the Librem 5, and nothing really in terms of software. But at least the hardware is designed with some privacy goals. The Pine64 company is well known for making a single board computer, or SBC, that competes with the Raspberry Pi, so they're already known as a hardware company making inexpensive devices. These phones are different than the old tries at a Linux phone. Whether they succeed or not remains to be seen. I want them to succeed. By the way, there are ways to make some old Android phones become Linux phones using Ubuntu Touch. I will make a separate video for that, and I will explain why that's different than buying these new phones. Since there are two options, I will start comparing the specs of these phones and then you can study these specs and maybe come up with a conclusion on which one you should buy. To start with, the Librem 5 phone retails for about $700. I don't know what the final retail price of the Pinephone will be, but currently developers can buy it for $150 approximately. This is a very limited group that can have access to the Pinephone, so it's possible that they will adjust the final price or adjust the specs. As I'm comparing the phones, you can do some math in your head as to the actual differences in parts. First thing to compare is the CPU. The Librem 5 uses the NXP i.MX8M chip, and the Pinephone uses the all-winner A64. These are both quad-core ARM Cortex-A53s. The difference is that the one on the Librem 5 runs at 1.5 GHz, and the one on the Pinephone runs a little slower at 1.2 GHz. In addition, the one on the Librem 5, the NXP chip, has an auxiliary processor called a Cortex M4. So that's taken on some extra unknown tasks. So you have a quad core plus an extra auxiliary core. And that will, of course, translate to higher performance. Just for comparison, the cost of the CPU chip on the Pinephone is $5, while on the Librem 5, the CPU is $20. By the way, kind of a side note, there are some comparisons of the all-winner A64 chip versus a Raspberry Pi 3B+. And the all-winner A64 was 2 to 10 times faster than a Raspberry Pi. Memory access was a main reason for the advantage. Based on inference here, since there's no direct testing available, I would say that the NXP chip would be faster than the Pinephone chip. So at least we can guess that these devices will be many times faster than a newer Raspberry Pi. How much faster when comparing the two chips together? Other than knowing that the Librem 5 CPU will be faster, I couldn't tell you how much faster. Now let's talk about the GPU. The one on the Librem 5 is built into the board is a Vivante GC7000L quad core, and the one on the Pinephone is a Mali 400 MP2, 2 cores. Now there's actually a comparison of a 4-core version of the Mali 400 and a 4-core version of the Vivante, and the Vivante is slightly faster than the 4-core Mali. But here we have a 2-core Mali, so we could guess that it could be up to 2 times faster for the GPU. Now both of these GPUs are low-end GPUs. Where this would be a big deal would be in gaming versus video. Neither device is suited for high-end videos like 4K or gaming, but I would expect that comparably the Librem 5 will be faster. Now let's talk about the LCD screen, and both of them are IPS, so they're bright screens, and the Librem 5 is 5.7 inches, and the one on the Pinephone is 5.95 inches. So the one on the Pinephone is slightly larger. However, both have the same screen size, which is 1440 by 720 or 720p. So the Pinephone just has larger pixels, but not necessarily a higher resolution. So I would say they're equal there. Now let's talk about the RAM. So on the Librem 5, that has 3 gigabytes versus only 2 gigabytes on the Pinephone. This will have an effect on running the device when you have several apps. Now each of these devices have kind of a flash drive. It's called eMMC, and that is 32 gigabytes on the Librem 5 and 16 gigabytes on the Pinephone. Now the Pinephone can support between 16 gigabytes and 64 gigabytes, but I've seen it mostly with the 16 gigabytes. So they may change the configuration on final shipping. I don't really know. And I presume too that that's replaceable because it's just a plug-in. Now let's talk about the cell portion. Both support 3G and 4G LTE, and the one on the Librem 5 is plugged into the M2 slot, so it's a pluggable baseband modem, and the one on the Pinephone is actually soldered in. The Pinephone uses a micro SIM, while the Librem 5 uses a smaller nano SIM. The Librem 5 gives you 2 choices of modems, and you can actually replace the baseband model later on because it's just plugged in. Neither device will support 5G in the future. Now for privacy reasons, I'm happy with that, though in the long term it will be an issue. And again, this is not a big deal. Most phones will have a lifespan under 5 years, and this phone will run fine with LTE for that amount of time. Now here's where the major differences are between the Pinephone and the Librem 5. The first is in the Wi-Fi. The Librem 5 supports A, B, G, N of the 802.11 standard, while the Pinephone only supports B, G, and N. Now what this means is that the Pinephone does not support 5 gigahertz. The Librem 5 supports 2.4 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz, so the Pinephone is single band. That's a big difference, and that's significant. The second big difference is in the camera. The Pinephone only has a 5 megapixel on the back and 2 megapixel in the front. The Librem 5 has 13 megapixels in the back and 8 megapixels in the front, so it's more like a modern camera. So the camera on a Pinephone is quite limited. Another major limitation is the USB. So the Pinephone only has USB 2 support, so it can only send files back and forth on the USB-C port at USB 2 speeds, whereas the Librem 5 can handle USB 3 speeds, so much faster. And that's going to be significant if you're using the phone as a convergent device, meaning as a desktop computer as well as a mobile phone. Now let's talk about the battery. The battery on the Librem 5 is 3,500 milliwatt hours versus the 3,000 milliwatt hours on the Pinephone. So here you would see that there's a slight advantage on the Librem 5. It will have more battery life. But the Pinephone battery is actually only $15 to buy and is compatible with a Samsung J7 battery. And you can find these batteries at 3,500 milliamp hours. But probably they chose 300 milliamp hours to cut the cost down. So this looks to be easily user replaceable. So if you want to reach 3,500 milliamp hours, that's no big deal. The type of battery specified in the Purism site is described as user replaceable with a screwdriver. By the way, I hear that both devices use standard screws and not the complex combination of screws you find on an iPhone. Because the battery on a Pinephone is so easily replaced with a higher capacity one for cheap, I would say they're equal here. The biggest effect on privacy are the hardware switch. On the Librem 5, you can switch the LTE separately, the Wi-Fi and the Bluetooth separately, and the cameras and mic separately. And if you switch them all off, all sensors are also switched off. Now, on the Pinephone, you have a switch for the LTE and GPS, the Wi-Fi and the Bluetooth, and then the cameras. There's no switch for the other sensor. So they're somewhat similar, although only the Librem 5 can disable all the sensors. On the Pinephone dev kit, the switches seem to be dip switches on the back of the phone. So you have to open up the cover. So it's not suitable for quick on and off use in real life security situations. We've seen the switches on the Librem 5 and they appear to be easily adjusted on the fly. Now to the case and the form factor. The Librem 5 is mostly metal. The Pinephone is mostly plastic, though the plastic has been infused with some metal for heat dissipation. From pictures I've seen, the Pinephone will feel more toy-like, like the cheap Android, and the Librem 5 will have a more solid feel. On the other hand, a Pinephone is sized more like a standard phone, thinner. The Librem 5 is very thick, double the thickness of a modern iPhone. The reason for this is that the cell baseband modem and the Wi-Fi boards are plugged in on the top using those M2 slots, so they occupy extra space. So in summary, from a hardware point of view, though the specs of the Librem 5 are better than a Pinephone, it's pretty hard to explain the price difference of $550 as just a difference in parts. I suspect, and this is a guess, so someone with a better inventory of parts can tell me, that the price difference in parts between the two could be around $200. So it doesn't fully explain the price difference of an extra $350 beyond just profit. And they're entitled to a profit. I'm sure Apple makes more than that per phone. They're making less than you think though. When you understand that the extensive work on the Librem 5 is being done in software, and that the software is being added to the mainstream Debian code, other devices are benefiting from the work that Purism is doing. Thus, I will not begrudge them that extra income, which will ensure success of the whole idea of a Linux phone. The success of a Linux phone will be mostly due to the adaptation of Linux to a phone form factor. Ubuntu Touch was Canonical's attempt to do everything themselves to make a mobile version of Linux. It was a daunting task for Canonical, and yet they're a huge company and they failed. Fortunately, Ubuntu Touch has been taken over by another group called UBports, so at least the effort wasn't wasted. I'll make a video about UBports later on. In this case, Pine64 is not involved in any software development at all. They're expecting the community to come in and start developing drivers and user interfaces. Ubuntu Touch is being touted as working on a Pinephone, so we will see how well Ubuntu Touch works in general, and then we can apply that to the Pinephone. Much of the UX work has already been done by Purism, although most of the work Purism has done is for the GNOME desktop environment. Pine64 is mostly promoting the alternative KDE desktop platforms, and Ubuntu Touch is using the older desktop environment from Ubuntu called Unity. It's likely that the work being done by Purism will eventually work itself into all environments, but initially it will be an issue. The Librem 5 would be more potentially usable as a daily driver because of the software support. I expect the performance of the device to be more snappy. Given the lack of heat sinks, I would imagine that the Librem 5 in its first version here to run much hotter than a Pinephone. You will see the metal cover here, which would help in heat dissipation on the Pinephone. Now, where are we? Would I buy a Librem 5 or a Pinephone? Well, to be fair, I already ordered my Librem 5 and I'm waiting for it. And I also ordered a phone that I'm going to be installing Ubuntu Touch on, so that'll be separate, and that will be similar to a Pinephone. When the Pinephone becomes available, I will jump right on it. At the moment, the shipping development models of the Pinephone are for people working on the drivers and such, so it is not yet available for even a software developer to buy. I look at the Pinephone as more of a developer device right now. At that price, it's like buying a Raspberry Pi for development. It would cost at least that much to get a Raspberry Pi-like phone, so this is great, which gets me excited. But it may be initially limited in use by the average person since no one is specifically working on a Pinephone-specific software or user interface. It means that the user interface stuff is unknown. Pine64 is a hardware company, and it will take a while for software developers to create new drivers and apps for it. Now, as an interesting comparison, Pine64 has the Rock64 single-board computer, SBC, which competes with the Raspberry Pi. They have the same issues with the software on the Rock64. The main problem with using the Pine64 SBCs is that you have to deal with a lot of driver issues. So expect this kind of problems on a Pinephone. I expect it will not be an easy experience to set it up and use it. If you're going to compare both the Pinephone and the Librem 5 to, say, an iPhone, well, clearly the iPhone will outshine both in CPU power. The iPhone is approaching desktop computer speed, and this shows up in smoothness of videos like 4K, which is not really supported by the Linux phones. At best, they can support 1080. But then again, we are looking at 720p screens, so it's not really necessary for them to have this capability for the display. Where this comparison matters is in recording the videos. It would be possible to record 4K videos on a newer iPhone, while it would not be possible on these Linux phones. So, depending on what you do, you can see that there's some catching up required in CPU power. Here are some other limitations on these new phones. These are not meant to be secured black boxes like an iPhone. The idea here of a Librem 5 is to secure the transmissions of the phone data. An iPhone or Android does not have secure transmissions whatsoever, but they instead focus on security on the device. If the device gets stolen, it's kind of a limited purpose security. To me, the transmission security is much more important. I don't keep important documents or photos on the phone itself. So I personally think that turning the iPhone into a security safe is a useless marketing gimmick when all of your data is being leaked out anyway. On a Linux phone, there are immediate security advantages. No Wi-Fi triangulation. I can stop the location tracking or SIM jacking or Stingray spying on the cell baseband. I can stop the Wi-Fi from announcing my presence with automatic Wi-Fi probes. These are things I cannot control on an iPhone or an Android. Watch my videos on iPhone hardware switches so you will understand the detail of what I'm talking about. I hope you enjoy the content, and hopefully you'll feel like hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell. Thank you for watching.